Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Future Whenua Yarns. Rob here, Zeb obviously over to my right, and this week we've got a pretty special guest. So Amos has come to sit down with us in the plantation. I think it was the right setting. It seemed like the appropriate place to be.
Yep.
So Amos has been working with us a little bit on some projects. I'm going to let him sort of do his own introduction. But Zeb, before we kick off, anything you wanted to sort of dive into?
Yeah, no, just the serendipitous circumstances of our meeting and the direct flow that we've sort of been able to create. It's been awesome, and we've sort of reached a point in our business venture that we'll explore during this conversation, and it's pretty exciting times for Future Whenua and LITHOS.
Yeah. Yes, I mean that's probably the sort of the main thrust of the conversation today is talking about LITHOS, which is a project we've been working on for a little while now, and sort of really excited to push ahead. But I thought maybe useful for the kind of the audience's perspective to get a bit of a background on sort of what you've been up to for the last few years, and sort of what brought you down to this part of the world.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess without going too far back in time.
Yeah, we don't need baby stories or anything like that yet.
So, my favorite color? No. Yes, for the last decade or so, I've been working in the 3D printing industry. So there I did a lot of different stuff, from defense to automotive to whatever else you can think of, producing parts with plastics. That also led me around the world to see a lot of cool places, and one thing I noticed is that there's getting to be more and more of this plastic waste everywhere I went. So I was fortunate enough to end up in New Zealand 5 minutes before the borders closed. So I landed at 11:55 and got to make a run for customs. So I made it through, I think, at 11:58 on the last day that non-residents were allowed to come into the country. So
it's got a sort of Indiana Jones feel of sliding under the door just as it's closing. Yeah,
it was not nice.
Yeah. We were all just sitting here going, "What the heck's going on?" Meanwhile, you were booking it through the airport.
And at that point, it was like so early in the days of COVID that no one had any idea what was about to happen.
Yeah.
So I just figured that New Zealand seemed like a safer place to be than a lot of other places. So I found myself here and living in a van, and then just traveling around, spending lots of time surfing, and still working on building plastic parts for 3D printing, and starting to get this feeling that probably producing more and more plastic parts was not the best thing for our future generations. So I stepped away from that industry in August of 2021, so last year now. And since then I've been kind of searching for this route forward of how do I take these things that I'm deeply passionate about technology and development that way, and turn it into something more meaningful for not just us today, but kind of society as we go forward. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then so you ran into Zeb, and Zeb, you're better to tell this story than I am. So you guys obviously met, through this magical serendipitous field that you both seem to exude. Yeah.
Our fields blended finally. And
Yeah. Well, we met at Wellspace, awesome facility in Queenstown, sauna club, and it was just this conversation about you were talking about 3D printing, and I was sort of asking, what do you know about 3D printing structures? Because it's just deeply in the next stage of the development of this property, we really need to get some accommodation units. And so we've taken quite a full spectrum exploration of ecological solutions to housing, not wanting to just put a whole bunch of 3-bedroom standard homes up, but just thinking, so looking at natural construction, and at that point I'd really narrowed in thinking straw bale homes is the way to go, just because you're surrounding us right there. Our neighbours are grain farmers, so they've got a heap of straw, and then it was just looking, and we're in this woods, we've got heaps of pine, so you can use untreated pine framing actually to make these straw bales, and then you can actually use like a cob, which is a mixture of clay, sand, and other natural materials to clast over this, but as also part of the exploration of natural building, it was like looking at these the 3D and additive construction methods. So that was sort of where I was at my headspace, and led into our conversation. And it was just so happens that 3D printing on a small scale can really just scale up to a house scale.
It'll definitely mark down as one of those iconic moments where you arrive back going, I've met this guy. But the whole 3D printing thing has just gotten a lot bigger. So it's definitely one of those moments of like, I'm looking forward to meeting Amos, and then you came down pretty soon after that, and we spent an entire evening basically sitting around the dining table just talking about possibilities.
Yeah, ideas starting bouncing and growing
until we had a LITHOS.
Yeah, so maybe just to set the scene for the rest, do we want to just give our best definition of what LITHOS is?
Sure.
Everyone turns to look at Amos.
I got to think about what this is, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my definition in brief would be it's looking at additive manufacturing on a large scale, utilizing natural materials in either temporary or permanent settings. And I think that can go super broad, and that has been a challenge for us because we can all see the potential in all these different avenues of exploration. But, literally, I think last night was really the solidification of the idea into narrowing down to that sort of spear point and knowing exactly what we want to get out of it in the short to medium term.
Yeah. And that's been very much, if we look at, it's weird to say the traditional 3D printing industry, but was kind of the birth of that too, is that there was this cool technology and like, this can do anything you want. And then it was really when it started to narrow back down and like, these are the places that it can make the biggest difference. That's when that technology turned into something real and meaningful for many different industries and people around the world. So I'm stoked that we're going from that point of like, these endless possibilities, which our pile of stuff to do just kept growing and growing. And now it's really focusing on what can make a difference today and into the very near term future.
And we can't tease people anymore, so I'm going to leave. I'm going to go straight back to Zeb and say you've got to give the succinct definition of what we're going to be doing for the next 6 months to a year at least.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess when like the clay hit the road was when when you
there's not even a distant
no, it doesn't really work. Yeah. Do better. But was when you sent this video from Kirsten Dixon, and it was her exploring this company 3D Wasp, an Italian company who is 3D printing structures, livable structures, not with concrete but with earth materials, with clay. And so all of a sudden it was, because most of what's happening in the 3D printing of houses is done with cement, and we didn't really want to be just diving down that route because just adding heaps of cement to the mix. So the exploration of WASP technology and then the ensuing partnership sort of really gave birth to, okay, this is what we're going to do. And it's the birth and the origins of this was through creating a housing solution, and so fundamentally that's what we're going to be working towards. But then also just we can be 3D printing landscape architecture, anything from giant sculptures and replicas to something that might be more usable, like a raised bed garden system in a mandala shape that would be really hard to construct by hand, but this thing could really form the basis of it with this clay extruder. And yeah, it gives us a lot of options, as you've said, of how we can apply this technology. But we've sort of just defined it initially that we can be sort of, looking towards a higher end clientele that would want to be using this for marketing purposes and like large landscape, constructions. And then, we can cover that with sort of soil, and it's got already a hard clay base that we've printed with that's formed the shape, and we can put sort of compost over top and scatter seeds on. So all of a sudden we've got these really amazing and unique looking forms in the landscape that can be grown out of that would just be really unfeasible to try and find teams to do that. And then thinking if we sort of lead into that market, that'll give us the leeway and a bit of time to work through the sort of New Zealand building code and the regulatory standards on that measure, and just having a business case up front of where we could apply this technology as we then explore and develop the use case of creating an affordable housing solution.
Yeah, and I think that's our sort of North Star is, looking at what does the future of housing look like and what does the sustainable structure of the future look like. There's also just the pragmatism of that's going to take a long time, because there are a lot of regulatory hoops to jump through, a lot of testing to be done. You want to put people inside one of these and have it being tested in a quite a controlled setting so you can monitor all the aspects of it, and you can't do that overnight. So then it is, well, where can we best apply this technology? And I think it is that idea of, bringing the sort of the brand interaction and the marketing side of things out of a highly unsustainable, everything just gets biffed in the skip the second that the event's over or the marketing run is over. And, actually taking these structures and making them something that can sort of become a beneficial aspect of the landscape as, when it goes from being its current form to, degrading over time. Yeah. And it's quite, I think there's, if we're just talking about this euphemistically and sort of, describing it, I almost feel like I need to put a floating window sort of somewhere up here, with a little video overlay. So don't be surprised if we do end up having that. But it'll be somewhere in the frame.
Is it just going to be like here?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're just going to cover Amos entirely. Yeah. But yeah, I think that would help the audience a lot. Is just have a bit of a visual representation of what we're talking about, because it could be quite hard to sort of picture in your mind's eye as to what a 3D printed structure could look like. It doesn't have to conform to the sort of four walls and a roof, structure that we've all become so accustomed to because of the materials we, use for building.
Yeah, and that was some conversations with architects in the last week that kind of came up of, the value of this 3D printing technology is much like what we've seen with the smaller scale 3D printing, is that you go from like having to cut out of a square piece of wood or steel or whatever else into making what you want to now you can actually just form in whatever free flow shape. So I think it'll open a lot of doors for architects and designers around the world for that, certainly.
There's a lot of puns going on.
Yeah.
Doors opening, ground up, all that kind of thing, yeah.
So what was really exciting about that first video that we watched of the WASP 3D printer, they have this technology, the machine exists, it's printing stuff currently, and what they were doing was digging a hole here and printing a house here. So you end up with a livable structure, and there was a sort of bi-dome. You can't go into one, there's two domes mixed together, and it's just so aesthetically pleasing externally and inside. It would just be something that would be amazing to fall asleep under, these walls carved and sort of ribbed in the form of the layered construction that comes up. And then, like, how hyper-local is that? Literally, rather than exporting steel and jib and stuff from all over the world, they're digging a hole here and it's creating the house, and then we're left with a pond, a landscape feature for that dwelling. So it was just that hyper-local aspect of it, and then I suppose it ensued a whole bunch of research and just like the timing of the building industry and the like many woes that that's facing, in New Zealand and globally. And then, some of the stuff you were looking at, what was there, 100 building companies?
Well, I mean, it's got to be 120, 130 at this point. That was I called that a few months ago. Is basically, over 130, let's say confidently over 100 construction companies have gone to the wall in 2022 alone, just because of lack of access to supply chains.
Gone bankrupt into liquidation.
Absolutely, and I think that's a trend that I'm using euphemisms and analogies that may be specific to me alone. So thank you for doing the translation. But they have gone into liquidation, which would be the appropriate term to describe it. But it's indicative of a real systemic issue in the building industry. Is there's a massive fragility in these supply chains. New Zealand, like the world is experiencing this, but a small island nation experiences this on an amplified scale because, generally speaking, there's only one or two big players in the space that are the main, importers of these products or the main manufacturer of these products. And if any kind of disruption takes place, the whole industry grinds to a halt. Yeah. And it's because of the complexity, the thousands of different components that go into a modern home. It only takes one of those to go missing, and everyone starts scrambling because now everything grinds to a halt at the stage where that part would be being installed in the structure. So it's ridiculously fragile when you actually start to look at the underlying, sort of mechanisms that keep this whole industry alive, not to mention labor shortages, all the things that we're lining up on. If you were to look at the Venn diagram of sort of all these effects going on, what sits right at the center is it's a crisis in the sense that all these things are creating a confluence of, kind of issues, but it's also a massive opportunity to step back and say, are we doing this in the most intelligent way possible? Are we thinking about this, or is it just the inertia of the industry has carried us to this point, much in the same way that, we do a lot of things just because that's the way they're done. because there's sort of an inertia that gets built up in the system where supply chains start rolling, and all these things have so long of an effect to sort of slow down and change direction that nobody really wants to be the one to put the handbrake on and say, no, we've got to take a 90-degree turn left.
Well, it's like the building apprenticeship program essentially funds you through a specific type of building, and it's very, very much about like, walls, jib going up, and what jib owns 90% of the jib supply. One company owns that, and then all of a sudden they ran out of stock, and they were just building companies all around that. They've got a deadline for a house, and then all of a sudden it's 6 months until they can get the jib for that house, and it's sort of just like came really to the front of the fragility of the global supply chain.
So it's, I think it is the right moment to be taking that, full system sort of view and rethinking. Look, it's never going to change overnight. It's just not, that's not the way that, society works. But it does seem like the appropriate juncture to take that moment to look at the whole thing objectively and say, is this the smartest way we could be doing this? It's not ecologically sustainable, it's fragile, it creates issues, and frankly, are these the nicest places to inhabit? Are these, is this the ideal form that humans should inhabit when they're thinking about living in a home? And I would say there's a good argument to be made that it's not. Went on a bit of a rant there for a second.
No, but you have a good point. It's, as you were talking there, it's just reminded me of a lot of other industries that I've been a part of where they went through these massive changes, but change never happens unless there's a pain.
Yeah, cool.
Like if building supply chains never had issues and there's never a real pain point to change, then nobody looks into changing. And even now, a lot of people are going back to the way that things were and just hoping that we don't have this issue again, but it's not, in my mind, is not a very sustainable way.
And I think, it's important to also, I'm not trying to say that, we should just throw the building code out the window. No. I understand there is a very clear reason why we have these kind of regulatory structures, because you don't want cowboys going out there and building all sorts of hinky structures that are just, the first time an earthquake happens, and New Zealand, as it happens, tends to get earthquakes, they all fall down and people get killed. There's important reasons why we have a structure. It's just that it's time to take stock and really kind of look at this from an objective viewpoint. And I think there's all the players in the space need to come to the table on this and say, look, we need to start broadening our options a bit on what we consider to be a dwelling.
And this is also, though, when it comes, we have to look at our own projects through that light as well. Because if we take the time machine and go forward 10 years into the future, the chances that fully 3D printed houses are the right solution for everybody are, I would say, zero.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
It's one solution that can fit into this to deal with some of the supply chain issues, ease up some of the logistical problems with shipping stuff all around the world, create things. To Zeb's point, if you can get your building supplies from there and build a house here, it's pretty tough to beat that.
Yeah, it's compelling on a lot of fronts. But I still very much would like to build a timber frame straw bale house. I think that's it's a beautiful structure. I think it has a lot of advantages to it. But it's also that thing of, well, there's only so many shapes you can make with that. Timber framing, it works with 90-degree corners because it just makes life a whole lot easier. But I think there's just so many interesting ways in which you can apply the 3D printing technology. Also hybrid structures, where it's a blend of these different technologies going on simultaneously. I don't think it has to be this one-size-fits-all, end-all, it's the only thing. I completely agree. I've seen that in virtual reality. You will have seen that in 3D printing, where it can do everything. And then gradually people start to pull back a little bit and go, why should it do everything?
That's exactly it. Just because it can doesn't mean it should.
Yeah. VR rock climbing being my favorite example. It's just like, why? When rock climbing is something that any kind of able-bodied person can go out there and do, why would you build a virtual representation of it that is far less compelling on every front?
Yeah.
So I think it just for me, it's so compelling, and I know the use case for this, and I know the application for this technology just based on how many needs we have for it on this property alone. And so we've been taking a foray into agritourism for a few years now through the events, and also trying to bring people on for workshops. And we've got no accommodation for them because we're out in the wops, and we've only got the main house and Bruns's house, so there's no place for people to come. So we could have like a campground and or develop some big facility, but it's just like, what's the means to doing that? And then there's only a handful of local builders, and they're chalked up until like 2024. There's more need on housing construction than there is builders. So, and also because of our remote location, we're having to not just pay for the building, but for their travel to and from to come out here. And so a lot of rural properties are facing that. Some people have hour and a half travel times for their builders to get to site every single day, and it might be a project that will go for months. So if we had a technology that can do that printing, and it might only take 2 people to man it, and it can erect a house in less than a week, then, well, that's pretty exciting for me. And because I'm not talking about houses for a family of 4, I'm talking about someone coming to stay for 5 days while they do a workshop, or just for a VIP camping through Burning Horse. It doesn't need to have all the amenities of a 3 or 4 bedroom house. A dome's really sufficient for that. And so all of a sudden we could whip up 20 domes in a couple of months instead of one house. It's really compelling.
Well, there's a pragmatic element, but I also think there's an important aesthetic consideration there. A big part of Future Whenua is bringing people onto the land, because your environment informs your thinking. So then if we go and stick these people in a very bland, traditional, 4 walls and a roof, sort of 3-bedroom style house that, you can be anywhere in New Zealand, basically, if you're on the interior side of one of those and not really know where you are, aside from looking out a window. To elevate people's thinking to what these possibilities of the future can be, I think it's also important to make that structure sort of, there's an element of theatricality to it, where you want to put people in this mind frame of look at what can be done. Look at the possible, consider these opportunities in exploring things beyond just, what we all sort of take to expect from a house.
Yeah, it's a good way to get people more kind of immersed in
absolutely, things. And I think that shouldn't be undervalued. The consideration of the place in which you ask people to stay will inherently inform their experience of being there.
Certainly. I think that for me, there was a big shift last night in our conversation when we went from kind of, I would still say that the main focus was on housing, but there were so many other things that we're trying to kind of find our footing of which direction can we go to really make this happen. And when we started looking at this in more of that simplistic model of, can we focus on like the raised beds and the things of that sort, I think it does something pretty magical in that, not only does it give us an opportunity to start using this technology here to see how it works and figure out the limitations so that, we can start doing this testing, so we can start doing domes and houses, and this whole progression. It also gives us a recipe that we can roll out to other people around the world to do the same. So to tell someone in an area with completely different soil than us and completely different resources than us that like use this recipe to build a house and they don't have the amount of clay that we have isn't very feasible. But to say like, these are the structures you built, you're building your garden beds, these are the tests you're running on them, and now all of a sudden there's a recipe to go from you have an empty paddock or an empty field into like, this is something really meaningful. And I think that the potential to use this whole progression for us is very good to give a recipe back to people in a lot of other places of the world that have even more of a housing crisis than what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. It also, to me, it does bring back, similar to the last comment, it's the artistry in all things sort of approach where it's not just, a 4-sided garden bed that is there purely to, as a form of functionality. It's there to contain earth. It's like, no, now you can actually start to think about these non-linear forms and these sort of organic flowing forms that I do think elevate people's sort of, expectation of their environment. And then that starts to inform people's thinking that if this can be done on a small scale here, in a raised bed, what can be done on an environment scale? What can be done on an ecology scale? What can you start to zoom out and sort of view things as? And maybe it's a little grandiose to think that, but I just think that even just those little parts of people's existence that get slightly more sort of interesting, you know what I mean, sort of, inspires curiosity and drives people to think beyond what they know. Yeah. I do think it has a network effect. I think it's a rising tide sort of approach where everyone is elevated just, through a few small little bits of beautification.
Yeah, this brings me back to a much bigger topic we don't need to go into deeply here, but around education and kind of education reform, getting people showing people what's possible instead of exactly this is how you measure the 90-degree angles.
Yeah.
It's giving people that spark to go and test, and maybe handing them the tool and saying, explore.
Yeah.
And I think that I know you guys have had some involvement, and myself as well, with the guys at the Liger Leadership Academy, and for me, another really cool thing about this is the potential to have students involved with this, and people learning about what this is, because all of our minds are already set on something, and we've spent decades learning how the world is, and it's really hard for us to unlearn that. But when you bring kids into the equation, or students into the equation, it's like no one's told them what they can and can't do, and now all of a sudden, maybe we can figure out the technical aspects of how do we make our visions come to life. But I think the people that are really going to take it to the next level are the students that, of course you want to build a house with timber frame, And
as we grow up and evolve and life throws you all these things, it sort of starts to build this ceiling above you, ceiling of possibility and what's practical, and all of a sudden you start exploring options like 3D printing on a large scale and creating sort of anything, and it just lifts that ceiling of possibility a bit higher, or sort of removes some board that was there. And having that as a youth and at any time really to lift the ceiling, and it's liberating.
But it can also be scary, right? Because if for any of us, if there's an idea that comes in, it's hard to say, but there are some ideas that are too extreme even for us to be like, yeah, that's a good plan. But
I believe that formed part of the conversation last night.
But it can make people really uncomfortable in that the way the houses have always been for everyone that we interact with for all of our lives has been a timber frame house or concrete or whatever other material. But to say that there's another option, at a certain point inside of me, and I think inside of a lot of people, you question so have I been wrong my whole life? And it's a really confronting question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that part of this around the regulatory side, that we need to work through is not only the physical testing, but it's the perception of it's okay to change and grow, and it's not that you were wrong before, but there's just another right version.
Oh, it's funny that you said, because if you look at a lot of the 3D printed structures that are going up right now, they very closely resemble a traditional house. Yep. If not, they are...
Maybe they'll have a little bit more of a curve in one of the walls, but the wall is still straight.
Yeah, the wall is still straight. It still meets in a 90-degree corner, and and there's an expediency to that, because I haven't had to fit a bed to a curved wall yet, but I imagine there's a bit of a pain to it, because you end up with a weird gap behind it. We've built all of these objects, in
to
planar
fit into
fashion.
that space.
So it does take quite a mental shift in sort of approach. But I also think that with the technology, the Tekla house is something I've become really quite fascinated with, which is the house that I was describing before. It's this sort of organic form of two domes blended together. They built almost all of the sort of amenities into the actual print itself. Yeah. So then it was just a case of basically, right, there's going to be a tabletop here, so we basically build that out of the structure itself, and then we're just dropping a wooden top on the surface. I think it does take that kind of step back and really think through every aspect of human structures and ergonomics and flow and how it is, how best we can design these things. But I suspect, and maybe it's personal bias, but I do think once people get a chance to actually start spending some time in these things, we are drawn to organic forms. We were just talking before we started about forest bathing. There's this clear beneficial effect of putting people in natural environments. And I just inherently have that feeling that once people start getting a chance to experience this, and it becomes not necessarily a regular part of their life, but something that, anyone has the opportunity, like VR was 10 years ago, maybe it's 0.01% of the world population ever got the chance to put one of these headsets on. Now it's not that hard to believe that one of your friends is going to have one lurking somewhere. It might not be the latest and greatest, but you get a chance to play with it. Yeah. And it's just once these things get more into people's hands and in their lives, I don't know that we'll have to be, banging the drum going, 3D printed houses are the best, they're amazing because of X, Y, Z reasons. I think it's just going to start to take, that direction as people explore these potentials.
I think that there's we had a conversation, our conversation before the housing last night went way down this hemp rabbit hole about how that industry works. And I think that by us continually referring to this, today, fine, but into the years as a 3D printed house, is doing a disservice to everybody, because it's not. It's a free form factor building.
Yeah.
Like, you can now build the shape that you want and that feels good to you to be in. Like, the technology is one tiny piece of that. And that's not, people aren't going to buy technologies, and like, I don't want to buy a technology for my house. I want to have a beautiful place to live. You know, and like, if that's made because Zeb's got some free time and wants to build it out of straw bales for me, or 3D printed or whatever else, like, that's the beauty of it for me, is that you can have something incredible and it actually fits with this environment and kind of the sustainability side. That it happened to be done with a certain technology doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But yeah, for now it is helpful in referring to that, to use those phrases. But
yeah,
it's like, for 100,000 years we've been evolving, living in caves and dens and mud huts and things with straw over them, and it's only very recently where we've moved into this. And it's sort of also very recently that we've moved culturally into a separation from nature. And so when we're living in a natural shaped form, you know, nature doesn't have straight lines, it's got curves and it's got, you know, natural materials. So if we were to start living in a structure like that, you know, we've got a somatic memory of that evolutionary process that's led us to now. So I think deeply engaged, we know about living and sleeping and dwelling in something like this. So does that restore? Does that, you know, a lot of what we've been exploring on this podcast, you know, some of it's very hands-on solutions in the rural sector, and other parts of it is very much mindset shift, and how do we influence our worldview to align with nature much more. And if you are living in something, a natural shaped structure, or is that just going to like fast forward, you know, rather than listening to a podcast about changing your mindset, go have you know, live in a month in a dome that's printed out of clay. What's that going to do for the way that you interact with the natural world?
And there's so many subtle aspects of that. There's acoustics, there's, you know, just the resonance, there's the thickness of the walls, all that kind of stuff. They all play a psychological role in how we feel about these spaces. So it's, I was almost going to do it, and then I was like, I'm in the middle of, I'm sort of, you know, getting into the conversation, so I didn't want to get moved, but the fire did need tending. But yeah, I think definitely we shouldn't be underestimating, like, you know, there's multiple levels and multiple layers, you know, to make another pun, you know, to how this will impact people's experience of living in dwellings. You know, and I think there's an aspect of sort of, you know, harmonizing with an ancient part of ourselves around these sort of more organic forms. There's the novelty factor, there's, you know, the sort of the organic, that's jumping back to the previous point, but yeah, I just think there are lots of different ways in which this is going to change people's approach to living in structures, and it's why, for me, that is still our North Star, is looking at the housing, because I think that there's huge potential in that to see cultural change as well as just the physical manifestation of a building, just by offering people this whole new option, you know, for the way they live, without, you know, it becoming, you know, sort of a very stripped back, austere existence, but just thinking about things in a new form.
So we sort of talked about, you know, last night, just really having a reframe of not necessarily our intentions with LITHOS, but maybe the process or the stages to reach that point. Because, you know, we always know it might be a multi-year process before we're printing, you know, livable structures that are regulatory sound. And this reframe sort of stemmed from a chance meeting we had last weekend with this bloke, Jono, absolute champion, and he moved to Queenstown 6 years ago and bought 200-acre farm just outside Queenstown in a really affluent neighbourhood. And he started Queenstown Polo, and he hosted Mardi Gras there and has another big event coming up. And so we got to tour the farm with Jono, and we're sort of up the hillside just looking down at the farm, and it's very flat and open, and it could use something like to lift out of the land, just to, you know, create, you know, more trees planted and gardens and stuff would create it, but also like could something like a structure. And so we talked about the Queenstown Polo logo. It's really beautiful design, circular, and it's sort of the Q fits in with the P, and it's geometric, and it would be very hard to form. It would be probably $100,000 or $200,000 process to try and turn that into a sculpture traditionally. Whereas with this printer, we could really come up and really just take a 2D logo, expand it up, and fire it into the G code, and it would be able to print this, with a 6 meter radius, with a clay base. That again, and we thought that if it was a clay base or just an earthen base, we could cover that with some topsoil, scatter a wildflower mix in, and then all of a sudden, if we're sitting back on the hillside of Jono's place and looking down at this, you've got this ginormous logo of the Queenstown Polo that he could have situated either on the roadside where people driving past can see it, or maybe it's more as a part of the experience of his visitors.
Yeah.
And it was just like, wow, we don't have to wait 2 years and just, dabble in little projects while we're testing right from the get-go. As soon as we get this machine here, we can serve a clientele such as guys like Jono. And then we talked about wine vineyards, and you drive past these sort of affluent wine, and they often have these sculptures out front to sort of turn your eye and get you looking at their property. And what better way to do that with a giant organic representation of their logo?
Yeah, I mean, I think it simultaneously focuses the attention on a specific sort of way of doing this until we're at the point, I think in conjunction of reaching the point where we're working on houses. But it sort of promotes this whole philosophical shift in thinking about these big public sort of, for lack of a better word, they're marketing. It's a marketing effort. It's there to, as you say, to catch the eye, to draw your attention, to pull you towards a certain goal that somebody has for that effort. And yet almost all of that material, okay, fine, a big metal sculpture is going to sit there for a very long time, but it was pretty resource intensive to make. It required a lot of skilled labor, to produce in the first place. And over time, it is just going to degrade into something that is less aesthetically pleasing. It doesn't degrade into something that's more aesthetically pleasing. Yeah. So can you take that sort of the need of specific brand exercises or marketing or whatever it happens to be, events, festivals, all these things, are not. A lot of people will claim, the sustainability baked into what they're doing, but oftentimes they're just offsetting what they've done. Whereas if you look at things from a perspective of can you print these natural materials, then we can start to actually offer brands, offer companies the opportunity to be at sort of the vanguard of the what we can do from a sustainability standpoint for making these large scale sort of eye-catching, iconic pieces. But there's no expectation of them being there permanently, and we can effectively just roll them back into the raw earth that they came from once the run is done. So that to me is a hugely exciting thing. Jono being a perfect example of somebody who's a brilliant sort of test case for this application, but it opens it up in a big way to the sort of advertising and marketing world, to think about how they can still have the impact they want to have whilst also supporting a much more sustainable, if not regenerative, sort of approach to things.
Because I think that's that was a big tipping point for me last night. Was as we were talking about this, it became real that this isn't 3 years from now we can have something done. It's like we can potentially have a way to get other people around the community involved in making this happen, give them a route to make it happen, and from a few days later have something beautiful to show for it, to actually be a part of this. And it gives us good ways to test technology and get the data that we need to really roll that forward. And I think it becomes a much more tangible thing when we look at it in this way, that there's a business case today as well as into the future, and it's actually all under that North Star of how do we provide houses for people and give people a way to have something that really feels like home to them.
And I think also, like, our goal with the housing from the start was to create affordable housing, an affordable housing solution. And also at the start we talked about like how could this be implemented in the Pacific Islands who don't have the building industry there, and can you rock up to a place like that and print? And WASP has this project in Sudan where they're printing 100 of these Teakle homes for, and if we were pinched on having to extract the value, to make us wealthy men through this business, then it's going to be hard to do that alongside providing affordable housing. Whereas when we're sort of looking into, the price of some of these landscape sculptures, like, I know when I was landscaping in California, these people had $500,000 sculptures in their yards. And we looked at some seating arrangement with the fire you were showing, that was $500,000.
Yeah.
A lot of the sculpture that would be of any sort of size, close to what we could produce is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars territory. And if we can make these one-of-a-kind, beautiful assets that are publicly viewable as well, so everyone's getting that sense of awe and wonder as they go past, plus it's providing a really good asset to these clientele that can afford it, and that could sort of just like sustain our research and development through the housing side of it. It's just it's quite a nice, like it sort of landed well with all of us sort of orientated that way.
It turns this from like an enterprise without a real clear income stream to actually a social enterprise where we have income stream and the outlet to help a lot of people. Yeah, which I think is more aligned with what all of us stand for anyway.
As you observed, is that state change between being a salesman for the technology and being an advocate for, a potential outcome of the technology.
Yeah.
That it's just the conveyance, it's just the means of getting there.
Yeah.
It doesn't become the central theme of the process. It's just like we've chosen the 3D printing approach because it offers us the ability to get the forms that we're looking to, to be able to produce.
Yeah, it's a tool.
Because I think, there's a reason why these big sculptural pieces cost $500,000, because you're talking about highly skilled artisans who are having to handcraft these things, or a massive amount of legwork at the front end, doing CNC, doing all these kind of things to create these one-off pieces. And that's one-off is always going to cost the most. So I have no issue with these things being that expensive and being sort of that exclusive, but it also does mean that they tend to be cloistered away from, the public at large. And now you start to sort of broaden that out again to say, look, there are people who are going to want this for themselves, but also let's start thinking about the beautification of sort of public spaces and the novelty that you can promote and sort of ignite within people's mind just by having these things present in their world.
Yeah.
You talked about, not having to advocate the technology, but I would like to go there and take a bit more of a dive into the machine itself, and that's definitely not a Zeb subject. So if you'd want to riff on, like, particularly the machine that we're intending to buy.
Yeah, so the machine that we're looking at now is the one from WASP, like you've mentioned, and I think that it's important to back up to what WASP stands for there and how that's kind of aligned with what we're looking
Well,
at.
I think just prior to that, can we jump even further back and describe just very high level what is 3D printing? Because I think there will be people in the audience who, to him, that's just a jargon term that doesn't really mean much.
This is where I step in.
Yeah,
after a decade of doing this.
Yeah.
So 3D printing is this thing that's, to a lot of people, sounds like a magical thing because it's partly because the industry has kept it as this magical thing, and partially just because typically really good engineers aren't that good at explaining stuff simply. So we'll see if I'm a good engineer or better at explaining. So the simplest way of doing 3D printing is like an extrusion method, which what it is if you imagine a hot glue gun, and then you take the hot glue gun and you draw a circle on the table. Now you have a little circle of hot glue. You draw another circle on top of that, and another one on top of that. Eventually you build up a tube of hot glue. It's now hopefully not so hot. But that's, at the very simplest form, that's what 3D printing is. It's just stacking material on itself, but we're using computer controls to tell the material where to go. So when we zoom into bigger parts for cars or airplanes, it's just that with plastics. So it's carbon fiber, whatever else. And then when we step up another scale to that for housing and like the technology that WASP's doing, you're pushing through the building materials, whether that's concrete or dirt or clay or whatever else we're pushing through the system.
But it's we call it 3D printing, but in essence it is two-dimensional printing, just adding height at each layer point. So you could take 1,000 pieces of paper and cut out a slightly different shape on each one and stack them up, and you would end up with a three-dimensional form that had this complexity, but all it actually was the combination of a bunch of 2D forms.
So there's actually earlier technologies of 3D printing that was literally printer paper. You'd pull a piece in, then the machine would cut out a shape, it would pull another piece, cut out a shape, pull another piece, and at the end you'd be left with this shape. it was exactly that, just stacked paper. So that's really what you're building here, and it just happens to be a technology helps this happen instead of us having to be out there with the shovel and spreading the stuff. And I think where Wasp is doing a really cool job is, Zeb mentioned this a couple times, but a lot of their energy, and it seems that their company really exists to solve this housing problem of like, how do we create good quality, affordable homes for people? And through that, a lot of their energy went into that, and they realized that there wasn't this massive cash flow that they needed to dump the millions of dollars or millions of euros into this to keep developing as fast as they wanted to. So they've diversified, and they build other printers to print medical parts, to build parts for airplanes, parts for cars. And those are the things that fund this bigger mission of how do we create housing.
Well, it's interesting. I think you were about to mention it before I cut you off, but WASP is an acronym. It's, it's a description because they talk about the paper wasp as, sort of an inspiration, but the word WASP is an acronym. It's not, they're not referencing just the WASP itself.
What's the acronym?
World Advanced Saving Project.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a big
I've been
one.
reading the website quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, their company stands for this, which I think is pretty well aligned with what all of us exist for. It's not looking only at shareholder profits. It's the goal of creating a better world.
Yeah.
And so I think that aligns really well with what our team is trying to do. So that's, as they take this stacking material technology and blow it up, you can start to put things through there. The traditional 3D printing market, they have these hot glue guns that build. And how those companies make money is not with the hot glue gun, it's with the glue that goes inside.
Yeah.
Which is why WASP runs into issues, because they're not selling the dirt out of the ground to people. They're actually just selling the machine. So it's the revenue model of selling these machines is not as impressive to shareholders as it is if you sell the glue that goes into them.
I think there's still certain companies that would try to sell you the dirt in your back garden.
Oh,
put your 3D
100%
printer.
there.
Yeah.
100% there. I won't name names.
Yeah.
But yeah. You can buy special dirt that goes into it. But yeah, so I think that it's the mission as a whole is much more of a social mission of how do we make something incredible and then make it accessible to everybody. So the 3D printing technology, I guess, is there's some really cool options where you can actually just use clay, like you've mentioned a couple of times, to build things even like pottery in small containers that I'm certainly not skilled enough to do.
Yeah.
And I think there's really cool applications from the very small with 3D printing all the way up to the largest things you can think of. And WASP is one of many players in the world doing that. But since their focus is on this bigger picture of affordable and sustainable houses for people, I think that's why, I feel they're aligned with going down that mission with them.
No, I mean, I couldn't name another company that is more in alignment with the,
Yeah.
I mean, just the fact alone that the company's name is, it's a direct reference to the fact that we're kind of in crisis mode as a civilization, and that, it takes a combination of culture and technology to, really start to sort of shift that back in the right direction, and I have the utmost respect for the work they're doing.
Yeah, certainly. So the machine that we're looking at is, for the most part, has about a 6-meter diameter on it. So there's some ways to extend that as we were talking last night. So already, as far as a printer goes, a 6-meter diameter is a pretty big space to get started. So I think with our near-term aspirations, it'll be a very good fit to kind of, when technology touches the ground, start doing these things and start the testing process. And there's certainly ways to scale that technology to much larger scale.
Absolutely, and I think that's the important point to reference, is that you're not thinking of this printer as an enclosure that, that's your maximum volume that you can ever possibly look to develop. And we've seen there have been people in the structural space who sort of, it seems like they've approached it from that direction of that we can basically make these cells that then have to be carted to the site to be, bolted together, or you go with a much more sort of freeform approach. But WASP, well, it's ironic, not ironic, but it's an amazing coincidence considering my work in the sort of agriculture robotic space, where we landed on a very similar concept of looking at these sort of orbicular designs that can also then extend their range, across a larger space without having to also add more infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I couldn't be happier that that's the direction they're going in, because it suits me quite nicely. But I also just think it's a very smart way of approaching the problem.
Yeah.
Of, the high value part is the arm, it's the extruder, it's the controls, and then how do you keep relocating that to be able to grow these structures without having to also add tech?
So the basic structure of what they have is that they have a center tower and there's a crane arm, and that's what rotates around and builds layer by layer. So, yeah. It's, if you look at any construction crane, is a pretty good quick view of what it is.
Yeah, tower crane is a good analogy there, in the sense that you've got a central pylon that everything is basically rotating around.
And then off to the side, you've sort of got this hopper where clay is getting fed into, and it's mulching it into a uniform paste that goes through a hose.
Yeah, exactly. So there's off of this crane, there's a material feeder where we'll be doing any of the material mixing. So if it's with straight clay, fine, but if it's clay mixed with something, or like we talked last night with some of the temporary structures, if you could do like dirt and clay mixed with seeds for whatever you wanted, now all of a sudden when these things, when it actually builds apart, it's a beautiful mixture of all these different components. So like the one with seeds, it would destroy itself and take itself back into the environment after the growing season kicks off. So yeah, it's basically they're trying to automate more and more of this process, that if you look at traditional like cob houses, there's people mixing the materials by hand and doing all this, and it's how do we build something beautiful like that, but without having to have 30 people with their hands and feet in the mud making it happen. So kind of automated mixing and blending of materials.
Yeah, and that's probably the slight departure from, if people are familiar with 3D printing, as you think of either filaments or pellets, is that it's a continuous feed system. So basically you need to have this hopper being replenished with the material that's being blended into a consistent form that's then being piped through to the extruder. So that's sort of the requirement there. But again, it seems like WASP have come to quite an elegant solution in regards to thinking of this as sort of a turnkey kit that can go into a 20-foot shipping container and be trucked, shipped all over the world, but obviously trucked around locally and set up in very short order. I think it's less than a day for setup time, and then you're looking at sort of weeks, not months, for print times, and it all starts to seem a lot more doable. And feasible to be making these sort of explorations into new frontiers, because it's also, you're not committing months at a time to an experiment. It's we can get these kind of structures and these kind of temporary dwellings and all these other sort of explorations of the form up in short order, and then begin testing of how they weather, how they age, how they work with the environment, how what works, what doesn't. Can we add pigments and ochres and these kind of things to change the colors? And there's so many ways that we can be playing with it. It is rapid prototyping in that regards, in the sense that you're still retaining that part of the sort of 3D printing appeal, is that its iteration is a very quick part.
A quick note just on natural building in general, and it would be just that it can be a little bit derogatory towards it, a group of people playing in the mud and making mud huts and sort of cast aside. And I just would like to say that these are people that are working on maintaining and restoring ancient and critical knowledge that the human race needs to hold on to, I think.
Which is, I think, why this technology has a place, because we don't have enough people that know how to do that.
Absolutely.
That's something I would still, like you said with the straw bale house, I'd still love to be involved in projects like that. This is certainly not replacing.
And as we talked about last night, the integration of we can print the fine structure and get a really quality shape that would just be a little out of our own skill level, and if we did upskill and then sort of do the hand touch to finish. But it's I think it's a romantic idea, the idea of 30 people coming together and making mud bricks and building the structure out of that. I think that's incredible, and I'd love to see more and more of that. But right down here in rural Southland, there's not a great wealth of knowledge. There is the Natural Building Association of New Zealand, and there's a lot more activity sort of around the Nelson area. But there's certainly not a hive of people that have held onto that knowledge and are applying it down here. So a machine that can come and sort of supplement that, and it might even inspire more of those workshops with 30 people coming and doing it by hand and doing it together with the machine. It's just it's not here to replace that idea, but even to encourage it and work alongside it.
For sure. It's a way to bring that idea into this century. Of give it the little nudge forward using technology.
There's also no reason that, your teenage child happens to reverse the car into the side of the dome, and puts a big crack in it, where you get out the mud and you start mixing it and, you go old school. Like that's, the material is not radically different in any way, shape or form. So it's just a case of, it's the way in which you're applying those materials. I'm not suggesting that, if a car goes sailing through the side of your house, you get out some mud and start trying to fix it. But I think there is an approachability to this as from a technological standpoint, because it's not a jib sheet. It's not a highly machined piece of timber. It is back to something which, most people can sort of get their head around from a material mixing standpoint. I mean, I've got some children that I think could do a pretty good job of mixing some mud together and making, if given half a chance. So it's something that I think is kind of core knowledge still tucked away in there somewhere.
They just probably couldn't do like a giant life-size statue of David with it.
Yeah. Not today.
I mean, anatomically correct, maybe not. Yeah, some sort of monster blob version of David, maybe we could get pretty close. Yeah.
So when we started getting excited about this machine, and particularly, it took a grand total of about 1 week before you got in contact with them, and about 3 weeks before you had met with them in person. How were you able to make that personal relationship so quickly?
Yeah. So it's, from my past of working in that industry was obviously helped, but I think there's something to be said about you and I both, that it seems that having this intention of meeting people and making these connections, that it just happens. I mean, it's amazing the people that we've run into, and that you came up to Queenstown this week, and then we just happened to run into Jono and meet this just amazing human. That one of the many aspects around him is that he could be what would look like clientele for us. And I think that's very much the same with the guys from WASP. It's that I've been in this sphere with these type of people for a long time, just speaking at the conferences with them and doing all these rounds with those people. And it was just, tuning into like, I need to meet people that are on this path with me. And very quickly that materialized. So it's 2 weeks from now, I'll fly over there and spend a couple of days with them physically working on the technology. And I'll be one of those guys with a bucket of mud, mixing it, falling around the machine. So awesome. Really looking forward to that.
And I love that you go to the field as your response of how that happened. I suppose I was sort of wondering about, you have talked at these conferences and you have been around, and I'm just fascinated by your history and industry, and I was just wondering if there's anything particular you'd like to share about, because you've talked at Formula One events, and you've worked with the US military. Like these are pretty far out things for someone to experience, like in a 10-year engineering career.
Yeah, it was. I guess this is a little off of the LITHOS project, but it was early on in my engineering days. I finished school and I started the first job at Stratasys, this big 3D printing company, and I was by far the youngest person in the group that I was in. We were looking at like future reaching research on 3D printing. How do you use it in technology or in manufacturing, specifically the defense department? And I remember sitting in the room, and two of the people in the room were ex-Skunkwork employees, which is like the pinnacle of aerospace and defense. And I remember sitting there just fresh out of university, like talking to these 8 other people and just realizing like the chances of me being the best technical person in this room are very, very small. Then I thought, what could I be really good at to make up for this? And that's when I turned to public speaking as a big part of my job. So I decided I was going to become a great public speaker and a pretty good engineer and mix those together to see what happens. So throughout my career, where I really found a lot of traction was giving voice to those incredible technical people that basically they had an amazing story to tell. They just weren't really very good at repackaging it, and sure as hell did not want to stand up in front of 1,000 people.
Well, I was going to say, you picked an organization that is probably world-renowned for its displeasure at having to stand publicly and say anything. The Skunkworks are sort of, if you know, but that's about it.
Yeah, and that was a big part of it for me, is like, I realized that this human side of engineering is where where I felt really comfortable. Quickly that turned into me moving off to Europe for the Defense Department stuff, and then working very closely with Airbus, having a desk at McLaren for years. So I was as in the Formula One offices as you could possibly be. It was incredible. I got to see a lot of really, really smart people doing incredible things, and most of them, just like the Skunk Works guys, kind of tucked off in this little office. And on that same aspect, I've seen WASP at trade shows. They have a really big 3D printer that they bring to trade shows, like 3 meters tall. And I remember going to talk to them several times and asking, like, why are you doing this? Because in my mind, what they were doing with plastics didn't make any sense. And then they would tell me this story of why they were doing it. And like from my brain at that point, I was just like, this isn't making me cash today. I don't need this. So I went back to the Formula One guys. Then as soon as you made this connection, we started talking about WASP. I'm like, wait, I actually know these people. Like I've talked to them many times, just like, what are you guys doing? And then when I started to look into it deeper, I'm like, oh, that's what you're doing. You were just more aligned with my mission now than you were my mission 5 years ago, being at the forefront of these cool plastic technologies. So that was a really eye-opening moment for me to realize that these last 10 years that I felt like were sort of wasted because I've been producing plastic parts all over the world, and like that's not something I really want to be involved with now. It went from feeling like that to being like, wait a minute, these are all connections and knowledge that can feed into this next stage that can do something incredible for humanity. Finding people like WASP and reconnecting with them was a big step for me of like coming back full circle, almost the hero's journey of that, of falling out, going a new path, and coming back into where I once was to realize that there are these beautiful things happening and these incredible people in this small sphere that I used to be a big part of.
Well, it's interesting because you can choose to view it through sort of two ways. One is just, you're just basically a leaf on the wind of chaos, and you've just sort of stumbled through all these various things and landed here. And the other is sort of, the reverse engineering approach. You're like, I'm at this point now. I have all of these relevant skills, networks, connections, and experience that are perfectly aligned with this, what I want to do now. I mean, how many times have we had this conversation where it's like, I look back at the last 15 years of experience that I've had. I'm like, it's kind of weird, actually, when you start to look at it and you think, oh boy, I've got all of these skills that now are they all come together to create this sort of really usable skill set when it comes to the types of challenges we're trying to solve. Yeah. And it is a strange, I'm not someone who's drawn by sort of ideas of fate and destiny or these kind of things, but it's a very strange phenomenon, and this odd feeling when you sort of start to think, what's going on here? I don't quite know that I can just put this down to chance anymore.
I got a new housemate the other day, and speaking of the affordable housing thing, that we always have to have other people living with us to make ends meet, and got a new temporary housemate the other day, and we were chatting about just a little bit about work experience and different stuff. And at a certain point, she stops. She's like, "How old are you?" Oh man, this is an awkward question. I was like, "How old do you think I am?" And, she refused to answer because she's apparently pretty intelligent, but I told her I was 35, and she's like, how the hell did you do that in those many years? And like, I think that a big part of it is something that Zeb is world class at, is just like looking for opportunities. And it's meeting the random person walking down the street and talking to these people. And there's been a lot of shifts through my career, and like getting into Formula One was a big part of that. I was like, I want to go see what McLaren's doing. And so I called somebody that I met a couple weeks earlier that was in the UK, and like, hey, I'm going to come see you. And I flew there, and I said, okay, where's McLaren? They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, I'd like to go there. Like, well, I guess I had a phone number from a guy once that was there, and just picked up the phone and called this guy, and like kicked off a whole new sector of my career that like I had no right to be in. I learned to build tractors at school. Now all of a sudden I'm building airplanes and Formula One cars. And, it's like, that's, I think, a beautiful thing about the journey of life, is that whether it is just like this random fluttering of the leaf, or it's something more clandestine, is that there are these beautiful steps along the way to bring you to the place that you are. And like, if you're willing to look at them, there's a reason for every different stage that we go through.
sorry, clandestine just made me think of hooded figures moving grand pieces around on the chessboard, being like, yes, it's time for Amos to move.
Yeah, sorry, man. You're gonna go to New Zealand and get trapped there for a couple years.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, by the way. If you are out there moving pieces, no.
Yeah. Another piece of your history we were just talking about before this that I'd like to maybe touch on, but you're a professional paintball player, and we are sitting here on the Montana Flat paintball course.
Yeah.
What's it like? What is being a professional paintball?
First of all, don't invest your time in that.
Not a money-making exercise. Noted, yeah.
No, but if I look at, so when I was 13, my parents brought my little brother and I, who was 11 at the time, just little cheap paintball guns. And the idea was that we were going to go behind Grandma's house and shoot each other with these paintball guns. One of my cousins got one. We had a great time, and we shot a box of 2,000 paintballs that weekend. And I remember my dad saying, you can't shoot that many paintballs in a weekend. Like, I'm 13, I don't have any money. And it was probably $40 for a box of 2,000 paintballs. You're like, there's no way you're going to be able to afford to do this. And I don't know if it was that part of it that made me make this horrible financial decision, or just like how much I loved it. But I realized that this was a game that was like everything I loved about growing up. And we would have these battles out in the windbreaks, like with sticks and sword fighting each other and playing tag and all these things. I was like, man, this is all of this mixed into one. And I went on this road of realizing that I was pretty good at that. It was my brother and my cousin and I, so it's always 2-on-1, and it would be the 2-on-1, and I kept winning. And I was like, man, maybe I can do this more. And soon I was 15, and I couldn't drive yet, so other people would have to come pick me up to go play tournaments with them. And the first tournament I took second place in, and that was like, I'm an incredibly competitive person, and that was just this fuel that like, I have to be the best. And then it went from playing once every couple of months when I happened to be at Grandma's house to like every Saturday and Sunday, finding a field that needed someone to manage it. Now it's every Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Opening a league on Monday, so now I can play Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, another one on Wednesday. Soon I was playing 4 or 5 days a week for probably a decade. And that led me to doing some amazing things through leadership and growing these teams. And at one point when I was 17, the sheriff from the local town, his son was playing with us, and we would travel all over the United States. I couldn't even rent a hotel room. But maybe like now, I just always had looked older than I looked. And I remember the sheriff, I was talking to him about getting a job with him where I would go into liquor stores and try to buy alcohol, and if the person sold it to me, they'd get fined. I was like, yeah, it'd be a sweet way to make money. Or an easy way, maybe not a very nice way. And he's like, no, you can't do that if you're under 21. I said, man, I'm 17. And he said, why am I letting my son travel with you? And it's just like this breaking moment for him. But yeah, so one thing that paintball really did for me is get me some of my closest friendships that I'll ever have. And yeah, that's competing. When I moved to Europe, I decided that I would stop playing competitively, and found myself sucked back into this after a year. And I was watching the competition, the World Cup in the US, where I'd played for years previously, and just like watching all my friends there, I realized like, this is the thing I love. And yeah, so I dumped back into it in Europe, quickly rose up to the professional league there, and played there up until the day that I came here. So came here expecting to stay for a few weeks and go back to play the next events. And actually today, the European World Cup is happening. So I'm missing yet another year of the World Championships today. So
yeah, if the paintballing community is wondering where Amos went, we've got him.
Yeah. I've gone full hippie out on the farm here.
Nice. I'm both excited and terrified to get the guns out and play this course with you.
I'm very excited to make that happen.
Yeah, I'm going to go full ghillie suit and just hide.
The good news is I've gotten considerably slower somehow than a couple years ago, so you guys should be all right. But no, it's an incredible sport that can really bring people together. And if you want teams of people to build quickly, Like that's a hell of a way to do it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because it's not like going to ropes courses and things is cool because you're in it together and there's adrenaline. Like I don't fully rely on you in a ropes course. Like if we're here in the woods or on the competitive fields, like we are everything. In that moment, the rest of the world drops away.
Yeah.
And it's the three of us. I had a moment when we were playing against the top-ranked team in the world, which happened to be the Russian Legion at that point. And it was me and my friend Jacek from Poland, and we had to hold them off for like 3 minutes or something. It's 5-on-2. And I remember sitting there holding my paintball gun, talking to Jacek, and realizing like this is probably the hardest situation I will ever be in this sport. And it's these people that were state-sponsored athletes from the time they were very young, all the way through, and just sitting there playing and realizing that like we were so connected in that moment that we weren't even speaking. It was like you could see and feel what the other person was doing. And for me, that's what makes paintball really beautiful, is it's that human connection between you and the people that you compete with. And like, I think it was about a month later, I learned what it was like to be the best man in a Polish wedding for Jacek. So that was another wild experience. But yeah, it's a beautiful sport that we should certainly come out and dabble in here.
Yeah, it's a cool thing that, just like group flow. And it's, my favorite book, Stealing Fire by Jamie Wheel, I reference it all the time. And it talks about that a lot because it's talking about like how Navy SEALs will go into this training and they just get to a point where they're really communicating energetically and they know what each other are doing, and if they don't, the stakes are so high. And in paintball, the stakes aren't like life or death, but you don't gonna get wasted. And it is, the blood is up. There's a different state of being that you're in such a situation. So it's a cool thing to experience without the thrill.
Yeah.
It being your
Sometimes
last
it
job.
feels like the threat is that high, but it's certainly considerably lower.
I mean, coming from the VR space, like you don't have to inhabit every aspect of a real world threat scenario to evoke a very similar physiological response. It's why they use basically a derivation of paintball for these military training things, is because it gives you almost everything. You can do force on force kind of training without the inherent risk. And it gives you, the same thing, the recoil, the impact, the smell, like the whole kind of sensory experience is there. So I think it makes perfect sense that you would feel very closely attuned to that. And you're right in the sense that these teams who have to work in these incredibly high stress scenarios, be it in a game, because, basically, I mean, any kind of game is effectively just a rendered down version of a real world, That's why we love watching one team versus another. Because it's one tribe versus another. It's as ancient as it gets when it becomes, comes to sort of combat and warfare. We've just sort of, metered it out a little bit so nobody, not everyone dies by the end of the game, because it gets a bit hard, to find people to play the game eventually.
Yeah, the Aztecs tried that route.
Well, I mean, look where that got them, I suppose. No space program for them.
Yeah.
All right. Fully guilty on the detour there. Sorry for steering us down that path.
It's a detour I'm happy to take any time. If you want like 6 hours just on the details of that, I've got the content.
Noted. He's got the content. LITHOS, we've given it a pretty good run over there. Maybe we could just touch on some of the just like out there applications that we've explored. Opportunities at some time when we've got the machine and we're millionaires and there's another branch that are printing affordable homes. How can we explore the full potential of this technology?
And I think that's, again, it's that, you have to kind of invert it yet again and say don't think of it as what can the technology do, and think more what, I suppose it's a tricky one, because I'm trying not to get back into that mindset of it's cool because it's 3D printed, but it inherently sort of starts pulling you back into that way of thinking about it. But I think replication is an area that I get very interested in, is the idea of being able to take, what was either once a physical thing that was then digitized and now you can rebuild it as a physical thing. That's very interesting to me. One of the big things I was excited about, well, not excited about, but at least, reassured by was back in, I think it's like 2014, 2015, where ISIS was sort of on a rampage going through the Middle East, destroying all these Mesopotamian era, historical sites. And there were teams of archaeologists basically in a race against time to try and beat them to these sites, to 3D scan these places, so that they would have some kind of record of these, sites. Because once they're gone, they're gone. There is no way of pulling that information back out of thin air. And yet it also ends up being now we just have these digital sort of, almost like a ghost of the real thing, and it's sort of just stuck in limbo. So then being able to start bringing these things back into the real world, or, printer Eastern Island head, printer, name something that most people just will not get to see in person.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very interesting application of the technology, because it is...
If we look back a few years ago, I was approached by, I think it was by the Smithsonian, to do a project on replicating violins from famous violinists. Is that the word? Must be.
Let's go with it.
Famous people that play violins. And basically, a lot of these really incredible people were like early 1800s, late 1700s even. And they had the violin still. But this sits in like a glass case that no one can touch. And they said, is there a way that we can print this? And so we can have it at the Children's Museum. And now the kid can play with it. And if it drops on the ground, it doesn't matter. Yeah. And so we looked at replicating ancient instruments and things like that. And they're already doing this for museums, is that you'll go into museums and they'll have 3D printed artifacts that are actually just replications. So it's like you said, like, I might not ever get to go to Easter Island, but I can experience that. And it's not only look at it, like I can touch it, I can climb up it. Yeah. And I think that bringing in more of the sensory side of that makes some really incredible options there.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And it's, I think that's a huge, that was one of the things that I used to get very excited, when I was playing in the virtual reality space, was how can you offer people experiences that they otherwise wouldn't be able to have? But it always fell apart at the tangibility side of things, because you could only look. You were limited to a very, it was sound and vision was basically the two sensory sort of inputs that you could mess with.
Yeah.
So then, when you do start thinking about pulling these things back out of the digital realm into a physical thing, yet without that, kind of terrifying notion that somebody could damage this priceless artifact by interacting with it, then suddenly we do get to be much more sort of, interactive with these historical objects and spaces. And I think that's a huge opportunity. I would love to go and see Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. But I have no idea who would even have to start to talk to get access to that site, because it's such a critical archaeological site.
Yeah.
And yet, we could be printing some of those massive tablets. They have the 3D data of this. The Smithsonian, I believe, has digitized their entire library. That's a huge opportunity. And obviously, small scale vases and stuff like that, that's fine. But there are objects that do go beyond that scale that we could be granting people, free access to, or even just having them as part of the sort of public artwork sphere.
Yeah.
Where, in a botanical garden or in a, just a green space in a city, you could be popping up these things that are iconic pieces of human history.
Yeah.
I think another one on the replication that we've explored is these like replica rock climbing molds. And so the idea was, we were talking about, there's these sort of famous transition moves, let's say up El Capitan and Yosemite, and you can really like, they practice these moves, because once you get up there, there's like a really tough cross, and until you're 1,000 feet in the air getting and spent a day on the wall to get to that point, then you get to do it. Whereas we could sort of get a scan of that piece of the wall, and that just as an example, but you could like take these sort of famous rock climbing moves that people like know of in that world, print them, and then you can sort of practice them at ground level before you get to that point. And I just think that's just cool.
But I also think that's where the natural materials really lends itself to the application there, because concrete is a uniform, there's no sort of variety in the surface texture. There's, yes, it can replicate, different sort of surfaces, and based on the aggregates you put in, you can get different levels of, sort of tactility, but the natural material, obviously this will come down to mixtures and blends and all these kinds of things, but it does give you a much more sort of sense of a real world object that I think you're grasping hold of. And, yeah, I think there's no reason why you couldn't, be replicating. Rock climbing is just a great example because it's a surface that you're having, a lot of contact with. You're trying to replicate these real world objects, so it's just sort of a perfect team up there of the technology and the application. And there's also market validation in the sense that a lot of people like going to rock climbing walls, and there are, in every city there is at least, generally speaking, one if not more rock climbing centers, and they will stay in the exact same form for 15, 20 years, basically until the holds start to break off the wall and they're like, I guess we've got to replace it. And they're generally speaking these big geometric planar forms because that's the manufacturing methodology. Sure, the holds are nice because you can do, injection molding and casting and stuff like that, but the general form of the thing's not going to change. So if you can offer that, in a 3D printed material that can just be rolled straight back into the base material and done, every 6 months, every year, whatever it happens to be, have a tournament come in and do a whole completely new setup just for the tournament. I think that to me is a really fun example of how this, technology can be applied, but also giving people, a sense of being in this real world setting.
And I think it's good because then you can keep talking about how dumb it is to do virtual reality and not finding it.
I finally get to do the full circle back around.
Your hero's journey is complete.
I probably bored a lot of people to tears talking about how stupid I thought VR rock climbing was, so it would be quite a nice redemption arc to be like, I've saved it.
I think that was one of the first conversations we ever had, certainly in that evening that came up.
Yeah. But it was just a perfect example of a technology being applied to something that made no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. Which happens, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah.
Back to that point.
So another one we've talked about is like rapid set design for movie and TV sets. And so Amos and I went to Wellington and we were sort of there and we went to Weta Workshop. And it was one of these moments where I was like, oh, damn, he's deep in this industry because we'd thought, because, they're really leaders in 3D printing and application in New Zealand. And so, my technique would just be to rock up and knock on the door and, see who's got something to say. And Amos was like, I know a guy. And then, sure enough, so the next afternoon we're in the boardroom, this long table, and there's just sort of these beautiful figurines down the center of the table, and on the side, all the avatars, all the Lord of the Rings, just lined the Grammys, Golden Globes, all in this big glass shelving unit. I'm sitting there like, man, this is pretty cool. And Amos was geeking out about 3D printing and just, lingo that I could hardly follow with, but it did lead into a lot of, oh wow, they sort of have to carve these huge rocks and sets out of polystyrene, and it's a lot of handcrafting to create these sets, paint it up, it's shot for 5 minutes, and then it's like this huge block of polystyrene into the dump. And it was just like, could we rapidly, for one, make the actual construction of it easier, the machine's doing it, and then two, it's left, you're using clay, so afterwards it doesn't have to be biffed, it can just be, broken down and, put into a garden or just reused.
Yeah, and I think that offers some very compelling opportunities, set design for theatrical things. I mean, Wasp has already done this.
Yeah.
So they did that. I think it was ABS or I can't remember what the base material was, but you can see in the way that the form went together, it's obviously a lot of small cells that have sort of been conjoined. But yeah, when you start to think about its applications for sort of replicating environments, then film and television becomes a pretty obvious sort of next step, because it is one of the most, sort of they spend a huge amount of money building these things. It involves artisans, who all come together for the, hyper intensive work period where they're doing day shift, night shift just to get all this stuff done. And then it all gets landfilled weeks later. So what better when you're thinking about large scale printing, what a better application. And also, generally speaking, they don't need anything above, sort of like 2-3 meters, because that's all going to be digitally put in anyway. Yeah. So it's not like you also exactly. It's just everything that's relevant to the frame of the camera. And sure, there'd be some niche applications as one scaling down something, but other than that, it's all pretty much 2 meters, 2-3 meters top height. And I think that it's an industry that, you know, could certainly do with a bit of a kick up the backside on, hey, look, you guys could be doing this in a much more sustainable fashion.
Yeah.
And, you know, also promoting, you know, and I would say even necessarily quicker, you know, and a one-to-one representation of things you then also want to have ported into a digital scene, because it's a digital asset that you've replicated in physical space. So then the digi guys aren't having to come in and scan all of these surfaces to get a one-to-one mapping for when they need to do all their, you know, rotoscoping and everything that goes over the top.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that to me is a very exciting application, and you know, New Zealand is renowned obviously for its sort of film industry. We punch well above our weight when it comes to film, as evidenced by the boardroom that you sat in with all the Oscars and Golden Globes sitting on the wall. You know, and that's
certainly.
I've always been, you know, I will admit to a painful amount of jealousy because I've wanted to work with Wes for the better part of 15 years, and you're both just in there in an afternoon, you know, jamming around, talking to all the cool people. But that's fine. That can come.
We'll plan another trip to Wellington. Go see Joseph.
But it's, I think, you know, of any kind of group that are likely to pick up on this thing, those are the people that, you know, are just a powerful force for making positive change in the industry. And, you know, people do look to them as a sort of a bellwether for where things are going next. So yeah, I think that's a hugely exciting opportunity, and what a great sort of innovation for New Zealand, the New Zealand film industry to be leaning on.
I think another thing that we've chatted a little bit about is something closer to the housing thing of just like, say we're looking to build a bit of a community out here on Montana Flats, and you're building structures for people to live in and building domes, then you still have this machine. You have your 10, 20 structures, whatever you end up with already built, and you can actually use the same technology to create other stuff around it, whether it's planters, vessels for catching water, some nice outdoor bathtubs, whatever you're into, right? You can use this for so many things, because that's the beauty of this technology and 3D printing in general, is that it's super versatile. You can plug it into a lot of different stuff. It's just picking which things to plug it into. And I think when we have a machine physically in hand and running, you know, it's just it comes down to exploring what else makes sense. You know, every house that we should build for somebody, what else should we drop into it for them? You know, is it a playground outside? Is it, you know, whatever?
And it's probably a pretty good place to start to wrap things up, because that's really at the heart of like, why is this a Future Whenua project? You know, for the future is this like incredibly exciting and huge potential technology, and then it's this whenua. You know, we're talking about using earth materials to create these structures that are integrated into a landscape, and they can be built in rural zones, like, you know, far away from the cities, that doesn't require the labor force, and it's just, it all works like quite neatly as a package to go with some of the, you know, the food production and everything else. It just like creates this way that we're living with the land.
Yeah, I think I'd be hard pressed to find a better example, a quintessential example of what Future Whenua strives to be, where you've got cutting edge technology mated to the most ancient of building, you know, materials, creating this sort of, you know, what's the saying that you often quote, you know, the sort of the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. Like that is that, you know, that I can't think of a better example than, you know, this ability. And you know, just to finish off, when you were talking about sort of looking down on this quite flat farmland from a higher, you know, perspective, the ability to really radically sort of alter that terrain with these large, you know, sort of forms and structures, it just creates a more interesting world. And I think that's an important thing. You know, something that inspires people to think beyond the boundaries that, you know, the sort of mental boundaries we build for ourselves, just by making a landscape that is more visually compelling than it was previously. Be that through the planting, be that through, you know, the exploration of your sort of living system, but also just in aesthetic form.
Well, Amos, it's been great to have you down on the farm once again.
It's always good to come down.
And it's very exciting to be walking this path with you. And for anyone that's interested to find out more about LITHOS, you can find out some information on the website, and of course just reach out. At that, hope you've enjoyed. Ka kite.